All right, it's 6 p.m., so we're going to get started right away. I've got a lot to do tonight, or a couple of longer things to do tonight, I should say. Before we get started, one of the things I want to mention real fast to everyone is that one of the things I know we've been trying to focus our energy on is making sure that we do the best we can to collaborate as best we can, focusing on our differences, some of the things we don't necessarily agree upon, but we're trying to find common ground, things like that. To that end, I want to make sure that we keep focusing on that. Now, I know that also we had talked about trying to get some time to sit down and work with MSBA. And so one of the things I'd like to have us do, if at all possible, but it's important that every single person can do it, is that on 8/31, it's one of our Wednesdays, I know that MSB is available to facilitate what would be a 3-hour session for us, and all that would be focused on that day is working on collaboration, working on who each of us are as people, and getting to know each other at a much deeper level, which I think will help us in terms of working together on other things as well. So what I need people to do is check their 8/31 calendars sometime during the course of the evening, and then circle back with me and let me know. Okay?
Can I ask, is that a daytime or an evening?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's an evening like it normally would be. Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be 6 o'clock on a Wednesday like we normally do. Good question. Yes.
That is open house night for all the schools.
Of course it is.
During the day would be no issue, but
Right.
yeah, I'm single mom that night. So.
Of course it's open house night because, why wouldn't it be? Thanks for bringing that up, Carrie. Okay, so what I can probably do is I can probably move that into the, think 3 to 6 or something along those lines too, if everybody can do that. Again, circle back with me, let me know, and I'm pretty sure I can probably get them to come down at that time as well. I think they blocked the day, actually, because I did not give them a time, just a day. So I think they blocked it. So if anybody has conflicts, we can hash that out. Yes.
Middle school starts at 5 p.m. with their open house on that Wednesday.
Okay. So the middle house, 3 to 5. Straight from here to middle school? Straight from here down the hall? Say again?
Well, and the only other thing, you probably wouldn't have to do it here. You could do it in the old boardroom, what's now at the district office. And then it wouldn't, unless as a parent, it's a conflict, right?
Yeah, it just comes down to logistics.
What I've done in the past too is I've brought my kids to board meetings and they just hang out in the conference room. I bring some crafts for them. So I don't know if that's something you're comfortable with. But
Or we can completely flip the script to make it 9 to 12, and start the day with it, or, that way it's clear of the end of school, it's clear of open house, it's clear of everything else, depending on what people's days look like on that day, and just flip it and make it the first thing in the morning, 9 to 12, something along those lines. Any thought, Jessica?
I'm good with any time on the 31st, just so.
Okay, I am too. 31st is fine with me. Becky, you working? Of course, sure. You work so much, I know. Wow. Okay, we'll have to circle back on it then. We'll just keep working on it because I want to make sure everybody's there. And I know it's hard to coordinate sometime, but we're going to find a day. Yes. Is that okay? Okay. So that being said, we're gonna jump into the meeting and jump into Finance 101. So I'm gonna turn it over to Superintendent McDowell. Thanks for that short conversation, everyone.
All right, so tonight's plan is to try and put some final touches on information regarding finance. And so we first up have Brad Lindell from C, Schools for Equity and Education. And followed by him, we will have our financial advisors from Ellers dig in a little bit more detail. So the hope is that this will kind of help put a box around all the stuff that we've been talking about to this point, so that by the time we get done with those presentations, we can have one final conversation about that long-range plan that we've talked about in the scenarios with Jen, and then we'll be in a good spot for you to have understanding of the plethora of school finance information that's out there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brett.
Oh, thanks, Bob. It's good to be here tonight. Grew up down the road in Cannon Falls, and so it's always good to get back to my, somewhat close to my neighborhood from when I was growing up. And I ran very slowly at the track in Hastings. So, well, it's good to be out here again. Hastings has been a member of C for a long time. Just a little bit about us. We're, I've got to do my own here, so. There. That's just some contact information that should be in the PowerPoint as to how to get a hold of us. And I think the thing we've been working on, our organization deals with equitable funding and equitable treatment of property taxpayers throughout the state. We'll talk a little bit more about what what kind of our members look like in terms of property wealth and in terms of funding, and that's why we're kind of zero in on a couple of concepts about property tax fairness, but then also funding fairness between districts. And I think I'll give examples and where Hastings fits on several things, and where's some things that probably need to happen at the legislative level to make the system more fair. We're 53 school districts located throughout Minnesota, about 1/3 of the state's population we represent over at the state legislature. Our district populations tend to not generate considerable categorical aids. I'll talk about those a little bit. And then also, we're low property wealth compared to districts throughout state. Hastings sits about state average in terms of property wealth, but you're in the metropolitan area and you go, especially if you drive about 30 miles west of here, you're going to see districts that have much higher property wealth. And so their property taxpayers pay far less per dollar of generated dollar than you do here in Hastings. So there's a tax fairness issue here, and that's kind of been the bellwether, kind of the central issue, which kind of differentiates us from other organizations. Not that the other school organizations aren't concerned about property taxes, but it's one of our primary reasons for existence is to look at the property tax system and how that doesn't jibe fairly, or how that creates an unfair property tax, unfair education funding system. We work, here we go. We work for equal access to high quality education for all public school students in the state. We want to make sure that the legislature, there's an equitable distribution of school resources, that the property tax funding system is fair, as I said earlier, that elected officials are held accountable for meeting those goals. And then also, we want to work with our community, with our school boards, with our parent groups to make sure that they're equipped to talk to legislators about issues of funding and tax fairness to help them. Again, as we go to the Capitol, we want to make sure we've got parent groups there helping us out, and we want to help the parents feel comfortable in doing that, and by giving them the information and the talking points, and to help, how we can make that work for Hastings, or how that is fashioned for Hastings to be able to talk to local legislators. Education funding is a constitutional mandate. Article 8, Section 1, or Article 13, Section 1. As you can see there, it's the duty of the legislature to establish general and uniform public schools, make provisions by taxation or otherwise to secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools. Transportation is also mentioned in the Constitution. Public safety is implied in the Constitution, but not spelled out in the Constitution. But education and transportation are clearly spelled out as things. This is what the legislature should be doing, and the governors, whatever the engines of government should be making sure that we're meeting those goals of a general and uniform system that's thorough and efficient. General education aid is the largest portion of state funding. It usually comes in the basic formula. You'll hear often about the basic formula. I'll show some data here later that shows how the basic formula hasn't kept up with inflation. But then also the general ed categorical aids. And you can see from the list there's a lot of different kind of levers and buttons and dials that have been created over the years for certain sets of school districts and to address certain needs that districts have. Unfortunately, those needs are vary throughout the state. They look different throughout the state, and so some districts will generate a lot of categorical aid. Our districts tend to not generate a lot of categorical aid. Some of that's geographically based, some of that's demographically based, some of it's based on English language or high concentrations of kids not speaking English. So again, there's a lot of different factors that go into the building of those categorical formulas. Then there's also the categorical aids and levies. We talk about special education, early childhood. Those are kind of in a different category, and we'll talk a little bit about those, hopefully not as exhaustive as I want to go through on the general ed piece. Per pupil formula, as you look at your district, you're going to be your number of pupils times your general education aid. That's going to give you the basic formula. Oh, I should have updated this. The basic formula for this year is 6863 and not 6728. So the next slide will show you that. If we look at the next slide, you'll see where Hastings sits compared to the state. And then also some of the little things that are hidden in those numbers where some of the differences do show up. Every district in the state is going to get that every student in the state gets a 6,863. Hastings gets a little more declining pupil aid than state average. Get a little bit more extended time aid. Those are declining pupils, pretty straightforward. That's you've lost students over the years, and so you're going to get a little bit of a pickup there. Compensatory is based on the free and reduced price lunch counts. As you can see there, you're well below the state average. Same with the EL population. You have a lower EL population, you're going to be well below state average there. Sparsity, that is based districts like way up northern Minnesota where you've got very few students in a very large geographic area. Those districts get a little bit of help. And so because it's just hard they've got very few students and because they're so geographically isolated, they have to run a school. And so they're going to need a little bit more of help in terms of transportation and then also just to be able to put together a program. Transportation sparsity, which is different than the other sparsity formula, you are running buses, and I know that Hastings is a fairly big geographic district, especially in the metro area. And so you're running buses and you're going out to pick up a lot of kids. I think you make it all the way down to New Trier, don't you? So there you go. Small schools is for districts with less than 800 kids. Operating capital, that's both your kind of ongoing needs in terms of building upkeep, but then also instructional materials is also included in that. The equity formula, it's really kind of mislabeled because it really doesn't stand, it's really not an equity formula anymore. It became kind of a catch-all. And there's a lot of things in that catch-all formula, but it really isn't narrowing the gap between the high and low revenue districts. That's what it originally was supposed to do, was to take districts that were at the low end of the spectrum, funding spectrum, and kind of compact that. But there's been a lot of changes to it over the years, and like I said, it's become kind of I call it a haven for mischief, for legislative mischief. It's like people say, how can I get money to my district? We'll put it in the equity formula. We'll fiddle around a little bit. The gifted and talented is straight dollars per every kid in the state of $13. The QComp teacher development and evaluation, Hastings is not participating in that. Have you worked on a plan or have you submitted a plan to the department? Back in 2000, that was one of Governor Palenti's, that's almost 20 years ago now, Governor Palenti established that program, and it was to get alternative compensation, different kinds of getting away of steps and lanes, putting different kinds of or more exhaustive and comprehensive staff development. Districts had to, the boards and the teachers union had to agree. The problem, though, is that right now there's been more and more people wanting to get in, but the department has, there's a capped amount of money. And it's not ongoing, so there's a waiting line of districts that want to get in to that program. But again, it's an inequity in the system because every district in the state is doing what is required on their teacher development and evaluation piece. And some districts are getting paid for it because they were QComp districts, and districts that aren't in QComp aren't getting that money for that. Something that we're going to look forward to because, again, looking at everyone's doing the teacher development and evaluation piece, and again, if everyone should be having the money to do that. There shouldn't be a certain set of districts that are in that program and not in that program. It's something that we're looking at. There's other things. The transition is that's another catch-all. That's been basically, as the formulas have changed over the years, some districts, formulas work better and don't work better. Sometimes they would lose money, so they would be put into a hold harmless. The other things kind of are straightforward, but then we get down to the referendum and local option revenue. And if you look at the bottom line, you'll see that Hastings sits right about at the state average. And your referendum and local option revenue is above the state average. That's because you have had to pass a referendum to make up for the monies that you're not getting on those other formulas. And so I think that's, and I just have done the rankings, and we're going to post the rankings. Every year we do rankings, districts throughout the state. And as I was doing the rankings, I noticed on the way out, today when I was looking at this to prepare for tonight, Hastings sits right about state average when you have your referendum in. But when you take the referendum and the local option revenue out, you drop down to about the 300th. You go from like 180 to 300 in terms of money per kid. And again, that's the current funding system is forcing you to have to go out and pass levies. And again, we need to look at that. It's good to have levies. It's good to have that conversation with your community and things like that. But to have as much money tied up into levies, especially levies that are unfair, we'll talk a little bit about that. It's something that does have to be remedied. One of the things we talk about a little bit in 2001 was Governor Ventura's big plan, and that's when he basically took over this. There used to be aid and levy in the basic formula, the general ed formula. The Governor Ventura made that all state aid, and thinking, well, there's enough. Back then there was a surplus, not as big as the surplus we're looking at now, but they thought, well, we're going to have enough money to keep putting money in the formula and increasing the formula. Unfortunately, again, 9/11 came along, recession after that, then another recession in about 2006, 2007. State has not been able to keep up. And so that has forced more and more districts to go back to their voters to pass levies because the state has not been able to keep up with funding the basic formula. Local property taxes went down because of that. But then when the state aid, again, when you hit that state aid wall, the property wealthy districts were able to say, we don't like going out and passing levies, but it's a lot easier for us than it is for districts with low property wealth. And so again, that's one of the things that we're trying to go back and fix to make sure that everybody is getting the same bang for their buck. Again, I've kind of gone through that. They did one of the things in the Ventura plan is he wanted to broaden the sales tax base. That was a non-starter. Raising taxes when you have a surplus is not something that usually finds much traction at the legislature. And so I think the thing is that we see the property tax system kind of was disrupted there, and it's just caused a lot of problems since. But again, as you can see there, it destabilized the education funding by making it far more reliant on how the state economy was doing, as opposed to having that kind of base property tax levy that everybody was levying at the same amount. There's a, kind of small type, but when we move to the next one, you can see that's the history of the basic formula and how it's not kept pace with inflation since 1991. So if you look at, there's a gap of over $1,600 per pupil between what the formula would have been had it followed inflation from 1991 until now. We've gone back to 1991. I think the Department of Education goes, I think, back to 2003 or 4, so their gap is not as big. But we've gone back and shown that there was a lot of things that were done that made the formula look like more, but it was just basically moving one set of dollars from one pot of money onto the basic formula with no real increase. And so again, it was one of these things where the legislature, and I'm not going to say they were dishonest or anything, everybody knew what they were doing, but those increases on the basic formula weren't as big as they appeared in the legislation, because they were oftentimes say that they were $100 increase on the formula, which was an increase, but then they took $100 from one other fund and put in there, so it looked like a $200 increase. And so, but the basic formula, the actual buying power, is more than $1,500 less because the basic formula hasn't kept with inflation. And while funding has been lagging, as you can see, all the things the legislature still requires you to do. And again, as we see last year during the legislative session, the House bill especially had many things that they wanted you to do. Many good, and some of those are very good things, but oftentimes there isn't money accompanying those requests. And so if you look at those things, again, and you can probably look, talking to your staff as to some of the things that are being required to do that money is not following with, and they're just assuming, you've got the money. Well, in many cases, you don't have the money. Special ed requirements, and we'll talk a little bit about special ed and show how Hastings is well above the state average in its terms of its cross-subsidy, which is kind of a technical term. But neither the state or federal or state government has stepped up and done special ed the way that it needs to be funded. And because of that, moving next, you get special ed funding. But your costs here in Hastings exceed those funds by over $1,200 a kid. And a lot of people say, well, then provide less services, but you can't. Those services are dictated by the IEPs, they're dictated by state and federal law, mostly federal law, that show that those are costs you are going to incur. And I think that we need to, one of the things last year that the MSBA really worked on very diligently was trying to get that cross-subsidy down. And there was money in the final bill that never came to fruition because they didn't come to agreement that would have reduced that cross-subsidy for you probably about $300 per pupil. And so that would have been something that would have been very, very helpful. But again, it's something we're going to take another run at next year. So again, one of the things where, again, this is kind of our wheelhouse in C is to talk about referendums and building bonds. And generally, that's the property tax. This is when you go to your voters for property taxes, with voter-approved property tax levies. Most of the other there are levies that are kind of dictated by the state that, the local option revenue is one. Again, there's aid and levy in the total operating capital. There's a few here and there where there are levies that you're just going to automatically do as a state. But these are the ones that we talk about with the voters. And we talk about voter-approved levies. And there's two different tax bases. One is the referendum tax base, the other is the adjusted net tax capacity. Ag land is not on the referendum. Ag land is on the building bonds. And so again, I know people don't think of Hastings as a farming community, but you do, especially you get south of here in Dakota County, you've got a fair number of farmers out there that are paying on the debt service piece. There have been some changes made to help them alleviate I think it's called the Ag Bond Credit, which I think is going to be up to about 65% of their property tax bite for bonds is going to be, goes out as an aid from the state. So here again, if we look at Hastings, if in Hastings, and Hastings is not at the full cap of, you're not at the referendum cap, you're at the 724 local option revenue cap, but you're not at the cap that goes higher on the referendum. You look at the districts, again, if you look, I talked about Hopkins and St. Louis Park. They've got an advantage out there because they've got a lot of commercial industrial property. For them to go to the cap on $250,000 house, it costs $387. In St. Louis Park, $419. Hastings, $842. Now you're not at the cap, so it's not $842. I'll show you where you are at, and this is pay 22 data. You know, Cannon Falls down the road, a little higher. You get to some of the places that are even a little property poorer when you get out to Belle Plaine, Owatonna, New Prague, but still, you're looking at more than twice as much for the same dollar of revenue as you are when you go look at Hopkins and St. Louis Park. So if you move to the next piece, you'll see that this is the amount that you have right now, and Hastings is sitting at $2,086. You pay $683, or a house, $250,000 house pays $683. You look in Hopkins, $388 for $2,553. So I mean that again, I don't want to pick on Hopkins. Good people out in Hopkins, but they've got an advantage and they've used it well. You don't have that advantage, and what we're trying to do and see is to make the property tax system work better, so that you're going to get either more money for the effort you're putting out or less property tax effort for the money you're currently raising. The equalization factors, this is where it gets to be, this is where I can have your eyes all glaze over in 5 minutes, and so I'll just go be very briefly. But basically what you do is the legislature picks an equalizing factor. It's a number, I wouldn't say that's picked out of the air, but it's kind of, we'll just say it's picked out of the tops of the trees. They've just grabbed a number to say this is what we think the aid levy should look like statewide. And then the problem is that they are expressed as constants and not tied to any property tax growth. So when we move to the next slide, and again, I don't have numbers on here, but going back to when this program was established for taxes payable in 1995, on its referendum, the first $315, I think, in that time, Hastings was getting 70% state aid and 30% levy. As you look, the blue line is your levy line and the green line is your aid line. And as you can see now, for most of, since 2017, your property tax, it's been 100% levy. And that's because those numbers, the equalization factors, the numbers that were kind of just like grabbed out of the air, have not been updated sufficiently. And so what we're trying to do in C is to say, you've got to update those numbers because we need our property tax poor districts need to have relief. And so that's what we're going to be working on. One of the things we're going to be working on is that. But again, that's kind of gives a graphic example as to what it means when those equalization factors aren't kind of tied to statewide growth in property growth. To sum up, critical funding for the state, the biggest part is the basic formula, hasn't kept pace with inflation. You will hear from some folks that, well, we put money into other things, and that's true. But oftentimes where that money is put, it really has to go to a certain purpose. That has helped your general funds a little bit, but again, for a district like Hastings, that's more reliant on the general ed formula because of the categoricals not working for you. That general ed formula being a closer reflection of inflation is absolutely crucial. And that's what we want to continue to push, is that our districts, the general education formula is far more important for our districts than it is for a lot of districts in the state. We need to have that general education formula reflect that, reflect what costs are. We also need to look at the special ed. Clearly, you've got more than $1,000 going from your general fund budget to pay for special ed costs. We need to beef up that special ed funding because, again, that money is you'll be able to keep more money in your general fund balance to help meet general fund needs or general education needs. Growing costs of mandated special ed services is unsustainable. The voter-approved levies oftentimes are being employed to make up for the inadequate state funding. We need to make that more fair, and we need to make sure the equalization reflects that and the equalization factors. The last two are just kind of shows that, education, E12 education is the #1 thing the state funds. And it does, I think that that's been sitting about that amount for a long time. But costs are going up. They continue to go up, and I think we just have to have the general ed formula, a greater reflection on that. But again, state expenditures, as you can see, all funds, against E12 drops from behind Health and Human Services, and a lot of that has to do with growing elderly population, of which I'm a member. So again, we can look at the state expenditures from all funds. And again, you can see that education's gone down. If you look at 1920 to 2005, 2006, Health and Human Services going up, education going down. And again, aging population. Enrollment has stayed about the same, but again, the number of older Minnesotans is rising. What can you do? You can get involved. I think for those of you, we're having our first legislative committee meeting. It's a Zoom meeting next Wednesday at 9:30. If anyone's interested, just email me. We'd love to have people. I have an open legislative committee. I love to have people just sit in and gives especially newer board members, newer administrators, chance to kind of get a better idea as what we're about, join in the conversation, meet some new people, see what's happening in other districts. We're going to be talking about a lot of those things, but then also what we're going to be doing is we do days on the Hill during legislative session, and hopefully we can, we try to get parents, not just board and administrators, but also parents from the community to come up and talk to legislators and talk about not just what's, I think, and that gives me an opportunity to not just talk about city things, but talk about some of the things that you might want to talk about with your legislators outside of our work. Again, spread the word. Use local papers. I think one thing, we've got an election coming up. I know after next week, we'll know who the candidates are for both parties. It's an opportunity to talk to them about equalization, talk about education funding. We're stand ready to help you in any way we can. If you have questions about, I'd like to ask my legislator about something about this. We stand as a resource for you to talk mostly about funding things, but again, to compare Hastings to other districts and things like that. When you talk about funding to your legislators, we can help supply you with tools to do that, to make you more comfortable and to give you data that you think can help make your case for Hastings. Again, organizing a legislative action committee in your community. And then, again, as I said, big election year this year. Everyone's talking about education. But I think, this is a chance looking at when you've got we don't know what the state budget's going to look like. We just don't know where the national economy is going to be going. I think that the puzzler to me is that I think when, 2 years ago when I think everybody was expecting a huge recession and it didn't happen, but now we're looking at a recession. That's probably or looking at likelihood of a recession. That's probably going to hit into the state budget surplus. But it's an awfully big surplus. So again, this is an opportunity to talk about to legislative candidates how to use that surplus. And again, we stand ready with you to talk about however you need to use us to help make your case, we stand ready to do. Here's our districts. I'm glad to see that Hastings, again, has been a member for quite a while, and we're always glad to, as you look at, we're kind of geographically spread. We've got, I think, one inner ring suburb, and I think everything else is either outer ring, ex-urban, and then we have some of the regional centers and some of the other growing districts. So, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come out and talk to you tonight. I hope I haven't bored you quite to death, but I guess the thing is, feel free to stand for any questions you might have. And again, our contact information is on the front of the presentation. Kim Springer was going to join me tonight, but her family has fallen ill with, I don't know which strain of COVID it is, but I think that's, she's staying home and doesn't sound real good on the phone. So I guess the thing is, both of us look forward to working with you. And again, whatever we can do to help, we're a value-added organization, and we want to make sure that our members are getting value. And so again, use us in the ways that you think that we can be helpful to you.
Great, thanks, Brad. Appreciate that. Any questions for Brad? Okay, then. Oh, well, I didn't say a hand. See, sometimes you're not in my periphery, but this will be okay.
If it comes to me, I'll
circle back. Yes,
So we'll let Director Malm just let that bubble. I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation and just grounding our board in the current experience, both legislative and district comparative. I had an opportunity a decade ago to go along on C's visits as a parent at that time, and we've been having conversations about a legislative action committee, or how can we start speaking more clearly as a board. And I just want to point out to the other folks at the table, like, this is how we start, right? Like, we have this data. We have your organization building a legislative platform and developing planks that if we approach it in the late fall and adopt it late fall, early winter, then we can become a voice in this conversation. You can help provide us comparative data, and we can become a voice in this conversation, because the size of the state surplus right now is very large, and the needs in education are very high.
Right.
And we just can't not be in that conversation, I think.
And just to pick up a little on that, I think that, part of what we do, and this has always been where when we bring the property tax piece to the legislature, this is property tax relief for districts that are already paying property taxes. And we've tried to get legislators, especially those legislators that are worried about taxes, to say, here's a way you can deliver relief to homeowners and business owners, farmers in your community. And again, that is, you can only spend $1 once. And I think a lot of people say, well, if you're spending it on tax relief, that's money that could go on the formula. Well, that's true to an extent, but the thing that we're after, though, is that we have property taxpayers right now that are being treated unfairly, and we need to make the system fair for them. I've advocated for years and years that this should be not talked about in the education budget as much as it's talked about in the whole framework of the tax system. And I think that's where we're making some headway in that direction, but a lot of it's going to be, we don't know who's going to have gavels come January 2023. And again, we might have to start from square one again with to try to make that. But I made some headway this year. It's just that the tax chair is not running again, so. So.
Very valid points.
Yeah.
Very.
Anybody else? No? No. All right, well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. And again, it's great to be out here. I just had a quick question. Is there still that track in downtown Hastings? There used to be like a track. I think it was called Todd Field. Is it still there?
It's our football.
It's not a track anymore.
Right, yeah. It's the only track that is not, a full lap is not a 440. And so we'd have to start like we were running the 100 and then go around the track. So it was like, it was like a 380 or something like that. So it was always kind of weird because, but.
We take pride in that.
And again, I don't think I ever got I don't think I ever scored a point up here, but that one really did stick with me, but.
Thanks again, Brad. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Oh, Bob, who's our next victim? Who's next up?
So we're going to have Jen Subert help reset. We're bringing our friends up from Ellers,
Sounds good.
and they are going to take us a little more deeply into finance as it relates specifically to Hastings and our budgets.
Yeah, so good evening tonight. My name is Matthew Hammer, and I've got my colleague Aaron Bushberger with me as well tonight. And we're going to walk through, we're the district's financial advisor, give you a little information about us, but then also dive into some of the opportunities as we work with the district on long-range planning as you move forward to think about. We are really into not only looking at capital planning typically with districts, but taking a holistic approach and looking at not only that side of the world that's important, but probably more importantly, the long-range plan from an operations perspective and how you make sure that you continue to maintain those programs and the things that people are interested in keeping or interested in exploring as you guys move forward. So I'll start with just flipping through a little bit about us. We work with about 65% of school districts in Minnesota. So we work with the vast majority of schools, and you'll see that we work typically on teams, which I have Aaron here with me tonight, but we have another team member you'll see a picture of here as well that was been in front of a few of you board members back in March. But the reason for that is we're out and about a lot, so we want to make sure that we can, when you need us at meetings, we're present and we're here to help you guys have the conversations that you need and get the information you need to make good decisions as you move forward. We also work with the vast majority of building elections and operating referendums in the state and have had a very good success rate in that regard when we explore those options with districts that we work with. So my name's Matt Hammer. Again, I said that I'm a full-time dad and full-time husband first, but also a municipal advisor here with the Ellers. And Aaron, I'll just let him introduce himself here briefly too. But I spent about 10 years in Fridley Public Schools before coming to Ellers as the finance director in operations. So I have a lot of background in schools. I've spent my entire career since around the early 2000s in K-12 education in Minnesota, but joined Ellers in 2018 and have been a financial advisor with Ellers since that time, working with districts across the state.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So I'm Aaron Bushberger. I've got 20 years of school district experience. I first started as an auditor of school districts, and then I've been a finance director for the past 15 years or so in 2 different metro school districts. So I've been with Ehlers for just about a year now. And then I'll mention Shelby McQuay. So her past experience is in the legislature. So she worked as an analyst there for different committees, including the Education Committee. You'll see the 3 of us there. We have a team of 7 of us. We have combined experience. Some of us have school district experience. Some of us have legislative experience. So really a good mix of team members that have a wide variety of backgrounds.
So we're going to dive into just some overview on specifically to your school district and kind of talk a little bit, piggyback on a little bit of what Brad was talking about of how this kind of fits in to some of the things that you guys are potentially looking at as we move forward. And I'm going to first start with just taxes in general. And our first slide really here is, as people are aware, when you get your property tax valuations that come from the county's assessing those valuations on an annual basis. But those are broken down into various classification categories or property type classifications. And you'll see typically in our suburban districts, those are dominated by residential valuations. So in this case, we're showing 3 different types of school districts across the state and kind of the differences from how those valuations and property types are broken out from a market value perspective. And this becomes important when you start thinking about who's paying the tax. So on the left is a suburban district where the residential homeowners are picking up the most of the bill, with commercial, industrial, and then not much ag property, obviously. And then when you get into some of the outstate districts, you'll see that have lots of seasonal rec or lake property, how the ag or those seasonal rec or cabin owners will kind of help support some of the taxes, specifically on the net tax capacity taxes, to pay some of those bills and relieve some of the burden on the local tax base. And then on the ag side, agricultural property, you can see on the far right where some of our districts, specifically down in the southwest, are dominated by that agricultural property, that the qualifying ag land's picking up a big chunk of taxes for those types of school districts. Brad alluded to it, but the ag credit has played a big role for those districts to help alleviate some of the tax burdens when districts are going out to vote on specifically school building bonds. Those debt service levies now, starting with taxes payable 23 for those districts, will be funded by 70% by the state's general fund, and then only picked up 30% by the ag owners. So there's been some relief there, but for Hastings, your ag property owners have been seeing that relief as well on your district's debt service levies as well, as that's been phasing in over time over the last, it started in 2018 and has been stepping up since that time. So when we look at Hastings, and this is Hastings' tax base, and like I said, this is unique to every school district in the state, and there's not anybody that's going to look exactly the same. But the market value on the left is the assessed values that are determined by the county assessors every year. And that breaks down into 2 tax bases as we go from left to right. The referendum market value tax base, that's there's only 4 tax levies that are spread on that tax base. Your operating referendum is, your local optional revenue is, your equity revenue, and then transition revenue for some districts that qualify are spread on the referendum market value tax base. Interestingly enough, this goes back to when Jesse Ventura was governor, and he didn't want to pay taxes on his cabin. So there was a second tax base created at that time to alleviate any taxes paid by seasonal rec owners and qualifying ag owners from paying on referendum market value levies. On the far right, that's where the vast majority of your school taxes are spread, including your school building bonds for your debt service levies, and then the rest of the categorical levies that Brad went through in some detail and during his presentation. You'll notice here with the qualifying ag property left out, and there's a tiny bit of seasonal rec that is left out. About 56% of any net tax capacity levy is paid by residential homeowners. About 14% is picked up by commercial industrial, not quite 8% by your ag property owners. And then there's smaller components for non-qualifying ag, which is the house, garage, and 1 acre, which we'll spend a little bit of time just kind of overviewing that, and then the little bit of seasonal rec that you have. That referendum market value tax base, that's a single tax rate. Everybody's going to pay the same amount based on your valuation of your property on referendum market value tax levies. But your net tax capacity tax levies have a classification rate. So you'll notice your commercial industrial tax base is picking up a little bit more on that component, and your residential homeowners are picking up a little less on those net tax capacity levies. And this will play into some of the conversation as we roll forward here on looking at different types of ways that districts are generating some additional revenue for operating budgets. Overall, your overall levy is about 55% made up of referendum market value levies right now, and then the other 45% is a net tax capacity levies. Just to hit on agricultural property a little bit, that component of the tax base that we had labeled there as qualifying ag, that excludes anybody that has ag homestead property in the district. Our an ag homestead, that house, garage, and 1 acre was listed in the qualifying ag component, and that component of a ag owner's property is taxed just like residential property owners. So they pay at the residential property tax rates. We did spend some time getting some information from Dakota County just on average farm size in Dakota County. Right now, based on what the county assessor was saying, average farms were ranging from 40 to 80 acres most typically, and the average value on a per acre basis was between $7,000 and $8,700 per acre. So that's some data that we were able to obtain just to give you some insight on how that's laying out. When we look at where you currently sit, and this is kind of an interesting piece of information as you kind of look at, okay, based on the taxes that our property owners are paying, our residential property owners specifically in this case, if we would take a $300,000 home and we would plop it into any one of the Dakota County school districts that we have listed here, you can see where a Hastings property owner compares to those other Dakota County districts right now. So you're third from the bottom with the districts in our comparison group. West St. Paul and Inver Grove are a little bit lower. And then starting with Burnsville, South St. Paul, Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan, Lakeville, and Farmington, they're a little bit higher. So the group average in this case is a little bit over $1,200 for a property that's valued at $300,000. I'm gonna stop for questions, and if anybody has any right now, we can answer those. And then I'm gonna let Aaron talk a little bit about equalization and how it impacts Hastings specifically here as we move forward.
I'm not sure how to frame the question. That's why I'm making this face. I'll circle back with you guys. It has more to do with the real estate market. And, you know, we're looking at $300,000 homes in Hastings. I'm like, how much of the marketplace is that? I mean, I got the question now. Currently in Hastings, if you guys have done some of the real estate analysis, $300,000 home, where does that fall in terms of $300,000 or less percentage of total homes in Hastings versus, of course, the ones that are actually being built now, which I'm sure the majority are not $300,000 homes, but higher than that. So have you taken that into account in terms of your numbers, in terms of how much of that base that we're looking at is $300,000 or less versus the other, which of course would be more taxes going in if the house is worth more?
Yeah, so, and actually, we're going to get to this in a little bit, but I can give it to you in the context of a median home value. So for the taxes payable next year, that median home value is $327,800. And so that's in some of the slides here, so you don't need to write that down. But in looking at that compared to last year's valuation, last year's average was about, I want to say like $280,000. So that has increased significantly. And as those new houses come on board, right, if they're valued higher, that's obviously going to continue to drive that median value up.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so a little bit about equalization, and I know Brad covered this in quite a bit of detail, but we've got a little bit of information on this. So really, as Brad said, it provides state funding for districts with lower property value. There's different formulas for different funding categories. So you can see in that second bullet there, we've got the 4 primary funding categories where equalization comes into play. It's operating referendum, LOR revenue, LTFM, and debt service. And so there's different formulas, as I mentioned. I think it's important to note that LTFM and debt service, those formulas are tied to statewide averages. So as those factors change over time, the equalization will change with it. So that's right what we like to see in statute, because those numbers will change as property values change. Other formulas that are in place, including the operating referendum, are static. And so as Brad showed, that green and blue bar chart, right, that's eroded over time because that number is static and because we've seen significant increase in property values over time. So a little bit specifically about Hastings. So we took a couple of other Dakota County school districts to show you. And there's a lot of details behind the scenes when it comes to equalization. So this is kind of a higher level look at that. But the top area there is referendum equalization. And so generally speaking, it's based on the total amount of your property value and the number of students that either are resident students in Hastings or the number of students you serve. So the example is for referendum equalization. So you can see there's a referendum market value. The market value of your property is $3.6 billion. You have 4,800 resident pupil units, we call them. So you have that calculation for you, 761,000. So as that number increases, right, that means your district, generally speaking, has more property value than other districts. So we'll compare it directly to the right at Farmington. So you can see Farmington has pretty much an identical market value that Hastings does. However, they have over 7,900 students that live in Farmington. And so their number is 465,000 referendum market value per resident pupil unit, significantly less than Hastings, right? So Farmington just happens to be kind of one of the lowest property value districts in the metro area. But so they're at 465,000. That threshold where state aid starts kicking in and relieving property taxpayers is $567,000. So anything above that is not going to qualify for any kind of state aid. Generally speaking, anything below that will qualify for state aid. So you can kind of see where Hastings is compared to Farmington. And then we also have Lakeville listed there as a comparative piece. So Farmington and Lakeville are one of the lower property value districts. I just took a look, and Edina, for example, their number is 1.4 million per resident pupil unit. So that's double than what Hastings is, right? But you're still in that same category, right? You still don't qualify for any state aid, even though they have double the amount of property value that Hastings does per student. And then on the bottom, it's a similar just calculation. It uses different factors for debt service, but it tends to tell a similar story as that first example that I talked about. So now we'll switch gears a little bit and talk more specifically about the operating referendum. So in that upper left orange box, there is a state cap that's in place, and that state cap does move with inflation, and I'll speak to inflation in a little bit here, but so you can see that number is changing over time, right? So for the 22-23 fiscal year, that number is $2,054.83 per student. The state does have inflationary factors, and so that number increases as inflation goes up. And so for the following fiscal year, that number is at $2,110.97 per student. Obviously, Hastings has an operating referendum, so you know some of the background that it obviously helps support your general fund and you know, your operating costs that come along with your general fund. In the bottom left-hand corner, we do make a note that voters can approve an operating referendum. There is a cap of 10 years in place, at which time, in order to continue the funding, you would need to go back and ask your voters to renew that operating referendum. So we're speaking in terms of different tax values, right? So as we've mentioned, as Matthew mentioned, the operating referendum is spread on referendum market value. The seasonal rec and the ag land does not pay, with the exception of the house garage and 1 acre. And as we've talked about, that can qualify for equalization aid. So specifically to Hastings now, you do have a current authority of $1,550.88 per student, and that's for the FY23 school year. That generates approximately $6.9 million for the district. As I mentioned, that current state cap you can see listed there, that's a difference between Hastings' amount and the state cap of just over $500. So if Hastings were to go to the state cap, that would generate approximately an additional $2.2 million. So the Hastings does have 2 different authorities in place. The first is currently at $665.21. That was approved by voters in November of 2013 for 10 years. It does have an annual inflationary adjustment built in. And I will mention about the inflationary factor. So that is not something that the local school board gets to decide what that number is. That's a state and legislative determined number based on inflation, right? And so we get our information from the Minnesota Department of Education. They update this inflationary estimate 2 to 3 times a year. So that number that we show up here is constantly changing, right? So if you seek to renew your operating referendum, and we come back next summer, that number is going to be different, right? It's still the same kind of core that the voters approved. It's just been adjusted for inflation over the course of the past 10 years.
I think I know the answer to this, but I appreciate that we don't set the inflation rate. That's not embedded in the voter approved levy. The board does decide whether or not to ask taxpayers for an inflation adjustment, right? That would be a board decision to include it or not include it.
Correct, yes, yep. And we'll have a slide here that will show some of that too. So that first authority then expires after the fiscal 2023-24 year. So districts can renew their operating referendum for the last 2 years of the referendum. So you can see an election, you could hold an election either in November of 2022 or November of 2023 to continue that funding. Then the second authority on the bottom there was approved by voters in November of 2017 for 10 years. Again, that includes an inflationary factor as well. And you can see the expiration and renewal requirements for that portion of the operating referendum. And so here's a chart comparing the Dakota County school districts regarding the operating referendum amount per student. You can see 5th in line there is Hastings at $1,551, and you can see the other Dakota County districts there. Each district by its name has an asterisk next to it, and that means that all districts' operating referendums shown on this chart are indexed to inflation. So, right, it's becoming more and more common. It's obviously common within Dakota County school districts, but just wanted to note that as well. So with that, I'll pause here regarding the operating referendum and ask if anybody has any questions. And then Matthew will continue on talking about another voter-approved opportunity in the capital project levy. So any questions at all?
Okay, seeing none, I'll say keep going there. Thanks.
Yeah, so back when, to your question before, back when the voters approved these authorities, the inflationary question was asked and it was built into the authority. So when you would go to renew, that would be the assumption, obviously, as it would be renewed. And if the district would decide not to want to, if they were renewing an authority and not wanting to, you know, there's that piece of language that's in there that says you're voting to extend an authority. Oddly enough, in statute, right, when you would change that number, if you would remove that inflationary number, you might not be able to use that. You're choosing to extend an authority, and you might have to say by voting yes, you're voting to increase your taxes. So that's just a caveat as you kind of think about these pieces. The district's full authority right now has that inflationary adjustment in it, and that was approved back when the authorities were put in place. We're going to move into another tool that school districts have to generate revenue for their operating budgets. And as we kind of think about these, for the vast majority of school districts in the metro area have some form of operating referendum authority. There's also another, it's often referred to as a tech levy. It's technically referred to in statute as a capital project levy, but most districts will refer to it as their tech levy. And about 65 to 70% of metro school districts have some form of technology levy already approved that they're generating revenue through to fund technology staffing, technology curriculum, tech training, those types of things that are helping to alleviate some of those costs that are in their budgets, and provide some additional resources for them as they're funding their needs as a school district. As we look at this tool, it differs a little bit from an operating referendum because it actually is a tax rate. And if you remember back to the operating referendum, that's a per pupil authority. So when you ask that question to voters, you're saying, do you authorize $1,550 in your case of authority that the district has on a per student basis to generate revenue? A capital project levy differs because it's based on a stated tax rate that is put in a ballot. So this is going to be based on a tax rate that will be taken times the district's net tax capacity, and then that'll generate amount of annual revenue on an ongoing basis for funding either capital projects such as deferred maintenance, or most often, specifically in the metro area, for technology costs. If districts choose to, there's some districts like Fridley Public Schools, for example, that has a capital project levy. It funds both technology and capital projects, deferred maintenance types things on an ongoing basis. Then there is a review and comment requirement that districts have to go through to get approval at the state, which is a simplified version of what districts have to go through when they're going to ask voters for a larger capital project through a school building bond issue. So it's a similar process, and you guys would have went through it in the past with those types of projects. So the nice thing about this is it does provide some balance. So some districts, if districts are experiencing declining enrollment, oftentimes that even though in your case you have some inflationary adjustment in your referendum, but your overall revenue through your operating referendum is declining as enrollment declines. In this case, you'd have a tax rate, and if the overall tax base of the school district grows, then your overall revenue generated through a capital project levy would grow at the same time. And then inversely, if the overall market value of the district was declining, then you'd have a little bit less revenue because it's a stated tax rate that's made as part of the ballot. So the other thing that differs in this case is the ballot question can be written more, it's not as set in statute as an operating referendum question. An operating referendum language and the language of all around what can be asked to the voters in an operating referendum question is very, very prescribed in statute, and there's not a lot of flexibility. In this case, districts can inform voters exactly of what they plan to spend the money on. So you'll see questions that are for capital projects, and they'll detail out we're going to spend the money on devices, technology infrastructure, training for staff, technology staff, so on and so forth. And that can be laid out in the question, which in some cases is important for people to know what the money is going to be used for, right? It can help in when folks get to the polls and are seeing the question, and they know exactly what the intent of the money is. So again, this is an annual levy, maximum length of 10 years. And when we kind of think of the means for districts to generate additional operating revenue through voter approval, these are the two means. So asking either an operating referendum question that has very broad authority, basically can be spent on anything, and then a capital project levy that has a little bit less, well, quite a bit less of what it can be used on, but there's a lot of technology costs, and districts are using this as a means to fund those costs and kind of, in essence, free up dollars in your general funds to be used on other things. So I touched on a few of these, but here's a graphical representation of kind of the differences. This is a levy that is spread on net tax capacity. So it's actually spread the way most of your school taxes are spread, unlike your referendum that is spread on referendum market value. In your case, it doesn't matter which one you're using because it's coming 100% through levy. For some districts, there is an analysis that needs to be done, obviously, because there is some state aid generated through the operating referendum formula sometimes. But in your case, your operating referendum is 100% levy, and anything you would add would be 100% levy. It's based on a tax rate, and in this case, there's not a there's no inflationary factor, but it does adjust with tax base, and there isn't a maximum amount you can ask for. So if you thought you needed $1 million, that you'd have a tax rate that we would estimate that would generate $1 million, and that's what would be put on the ballot, unlike a operating referendum where the maximum allowed in statute right now is about a little bit more than $2,000 per kid, or $2,055 per kid. Can strictly be used for technology and capital expenditures. And there's operating referendum the question can only be asked in November, and a capital project levy is a net tax capacity levy, which is similar to a school building bond question. And there's alternative dates that those can be put on the ballot: February, April, May, August, and November. Now, in your case, with the need to likely renew your operating referendum, you're likely going to be in November at some point in time, right? And so you've got a little bit of a limitation of, you could go at a different time, but it probably makes sense if you were knowing you're going to have to do that, you'd want to be out in November. And then the maximum length is 10 years for both of them. So this is something interesting as we typically look at operating dollars that are being generated by schools. So if you look strictly at an operating referendum, you'll see that Hastings here has an operating referendum And you would look at this comparison group and see that Hastings is a little bit maybe above the midline from the dollars that are being generated on a per student basis. But when we start to add in that extra component and we convert that capital project levy authority into a per student number, you'll see that Hastings is kind of more in the middle ground in that regard. And if we would look at the 48 metro school districts, you'd be below the midline in total and revenue being generated on a per student basis for school districts in the metro area. So you'll see here that we have most of your Dakota County neighbors have a capital project levy already that they're generating dollars to fund technology in their school districts. With Farmington being the exception, and it is something that we've talked to them about as well as part of their overall plan. So some differences here, and when we get into the tax impact, we often call this our smackdown because it kind of compares the two types of levies. And if we generated the exact same amount of money, so if we were looking at $1.5 million through an operating referendum and $1.5 million through a capital project levy, what would be the tax implications based on the different property types classifications? And you can see here that 327,000 number that we referenced earlier. Right now, that's based on assessment data 22, which will be the basis for taxes payable 23. That's the average market value for residential property in the Hastings School District. And as we go down, you'll see that if you remember when we talked about the difference between a referendum market value levy and a tax capacity levy, ag property is excluded from that paying on that operating referendum, but there is taxes paid by the ag property owners on the capital project levy. And then you'll see the difference there in the commercial property, albeit very close. There's some difference in regards to what they're paying. And then the residential, for the residential homeowner, it's a slightly less to generate the same amount of money through a capital project levy. Just to kind of provide some clarity for how ag taxes are calculated based on the chart we showed. If we take a 40 acre farm property, or let's just assume that was the 40 acre parcel and it was valued at $9,000 per acre, that would be valued at about $360,000 in total. A capital project levy on a 1 million and generating $1.5 million would cost that property about $56 annually on a tax impact. If we compare that to a $350,000 residential property from the previous, that residential property is paying about $107 annually, just to give you some context of what that per acre amount calculates to. Another item, and I know you've probably seen some information on this, is other post-employment benefit levy. And there was a period of time when school districts could, and you actually still can issue bonds for this, but there was a brief period of time where there were some special rules around where districts could issue OPEB bonds to fund their other post-employment benefit liabilities. And currently there's 22 out of 48 metro districts that have bonded for those liabilities. There's 9 out of the 48 that are levying for them on what we call a pay-go basis. So about 42 out of the 48 in total are levying for their obligations for OPEB. And there is some requirements around this. You can't just do it willy-nilly, right? And there has to be language in your collective bargaining agreements that basically sunsets them so that there isn't an ongoing liability to taxpayers in essence, right? There has to be some kind of time where this is going to be done. As you pay off those liabilities over time, they'll be eventually go away. So if you didn't have that sunset clause in your employee bargaining contracts, then districts aren't allowed to levy for those obligations. So 7 out of the 8 Dakota County districts are currently doing this. Either they're doing it on an ongoing pay-as-you-go basis, or they've bonded for them, or bonded for a portion of them at least. When we look at your district has recently made some changes in your collective bargaining agreements that would give you this authority that you previously didn't have. And that liability is estimated around a little bit more than $400,000 on an annual basis. And when we think of this is in essence generating some dollars into, you'd have this levy, it would come through tax levy revenue and then could offset other costs that you have in your operating budget as you move forward. And this is would be included, districts can include this as part of their levy process in September, and then gets final certified at a board level in December. So it doesn't require any voter approval. Districts can choose to do this on their own. And for the most part, you can see that most metro districts are already doing this in the area and throughout the state if they have the authority. So for an average value residential home, this would be projected at costing $29 annually based on our latest estimates of where this sits. And then you can see this again is a net tax capacity levy. So your commercial, industrial, and ag owners, you can see the potential implications for bringing that levy on. So I can stop there, and if there's any questions on that section.
Any questions for anybody on OPEB or any of the other vehicles in terms of the referendums or levies? Okay.
All right, and so I'll wrap up this presentation here, and I won't spend a whole lot of time because Brad covered a lot of this, but you'll hear the similar messages from us, right, that Brad gave you. So the reason why we're pointing out the operating referendum, the capital project levy, the OPEB levy, right, is obviously the other funding sources have not kept pace with inflation, and these are options to help bridge that gap. So just a little bit about the reliance on operating referendums. So on this next slide here, we'll show you our chart. We have a chart very similar to Brad. I think his goes back a little bit further, but we're really telling the same story, right? So since 2003, the formula has not kept pace with inflation. In that gray box, you can see there the legislative increases for the previous 2 years at 2.45% and 2% for the upcoming school year. I will mention too that, right, the 2% increase is only on the general education funding. It's not an increase on your entire revenue for your general fund, right? So I think that's important to continue to remind folks too that it's only on, that increase is only on a portion of your overall funding. And then on the orange there, you can see that we calculate that since 2003, if the funding formula did keep pace with inflation, it would be $1,263 higher per student. And just doing some quick math on the back of the napkin, that's about $6 million a year specifically for Hastings School District. So here's the chart we show. As I mentioned, it's a little bit different from Brad's, but tells the same story. I will point out kind of in the further right hand, you can see that blue line really significantly increased due to the inflation that we're currently seeing right now. So that blue line is what the general education funding formula would be if it would have kept pace with inflation. And the dotted orange line is what it has been over the course of the past 20 years. The next slide, Brad mentioned this as well, right? It's the special education cross subsidy that's creating pressure on the general fund. You can see there, the most recent data we have from the Department of Education shows a statewide gap of $673 million. They're projecting that to increase over the course or through 2025. That gap will increase to approximately $806 million. And so just to wrap up, next steps for us, really, it's, you know, Ellers being a resource for the district as you continue to have these conversations. We're going way forward now here, but in order to call for a November 2023 election, that timeline is actually in August in order to get all the paperwork, all the ballots, all of those requirements in order to have that November 23 election for renewing your current operating referendum. So with that, that concludes what we have for you. So Matthew and I are more than happy to answer any questions you have.
And I'll spend just a second here because I think what's important to kind of point out here too is the legislature was pretty proud when they did 2 and 2.45%, right? In the last session, that was kind of a bigger number than they had historically done. But you can see inflation right now. The actual number that MDE is using for 22 is 7.17%. So it went up 7.17% for FY22. They're projecting 5.5 for 23. And when we apply those factors out to based on what we know are the allowances for 23, if we would have looked at that chart 2 months ago, that gap would not be nearly what we're showing now. And you can see that number is kind of going off the charts on the backside when we kind of forecast out those inflationary pressures that school districts are going to see for getting the resources they need and those types of things for transportation and all those things that are needed to run schools. So just that's a little bit, I think Brad's was a little bit back one. We've forecasted it out just to kind of give you some kind of context on what it's looking at as we go forward.
All right. Director Tate has a question. Excellent.
So my question goes kind of back to Brian. I was thinking along the same lines when you were thinking about housing values. But now I'm thinking more about the housing market and what it's going to look like over the next several years. Thinking back to like 2006, 2007, when we had the big housing bubble and then it burst and people were underwater on their mortgage and housing values plummeted and all of that. Are those types of projections included in any of the work that you guys do when you look out into the future?
Yeah, currently, like with our capital project levy and those types of things, those are estimates based on your current state of where your current tax base is. So when we're putting those numbers up, we're saying what the projection to generate $1.5 million would be this right now. Obviously, if, for example, if we saw back when what we did for some districts saw declining tax bases back around 2010, 10-ish around to 2018. So districts that had capital project levies at that time saw decreases in revenue for those levies. So as the tax bases decline, their revenues actually decline. But I'll address more of the question around school tax levies and how they work from the standpoint of revenue generation, right? So it's different often than what you would see in a county or other municipality where they'll have more of a fixed tax rate that goes up and down as valuations go up and down. Schools, most of your levies are generated on a per student basis. So the dollar is the dollar being generated on a per student basis. That in essence isn't going to change. So if the tax base shrinks kind of overall, you're still generating the same dollar. The tax rate goes up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that as a property owner, you're paying more for taxes. Again, Aaron talked a little bit about as you get growth in the community and new houses are coming on and those types of things, that actually has a positive effect on your overall taxes that the individual property taxpayer is paying. So that individual property owner that's been in the community, now there's new development that is coming on and actually helping offset some of the taxes that are being paid by the current property owners, because we're still generating, if you have 4,000 students times whatever, that's the revenue a district's generating. So as more properties come on, the burden is coming down for those other taxpayers. So it's not as driven by what's going on from sales is what I would say, but the positive movement that's happened from development has actually been helping the local tax base for the most part. On the school side, now we don't know necessarily how the counties and other municipalities are being impacted, which is out of the district's control. Does that help answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Director Dean.
Thank you. I'm just would be curious to learn a little bit about current state and what other districts are doing right now. I think we felt like November 2022 was coming too fast given the rate of turnover that we had on our board, and we weren't in a place to make a decision to take action this year. So we're working towards being in a position to take action next year. And part of me is a little happy about that because this just feels like there's just a lot of headwind right now. But I'm just curious, given how many other districts you work with, do you see a lot of both capital levies, operating levy renewals that are either going a year early or just have to happen? What's the current state in that regard?
Yeah. So I'll speak to both. So from 22 was a unique year because if you remember back on that slide when we talked about net tax capacity levies, there's typically 5 times when school districts can go out for school building bonds, for example. And this year, because of the census year, April and May were off limits, so schools couldn't use those. So there's actually 15 voter-approved building bond elections going on right now in August, so for August 9th. And then from an operating perspective, it's not quite as active, but I'm thinking of the ones that we're working with. There's probably 5 or 6 operating referendum elections going on in November. Some are renewal, some are asking for additional revenue. Have a neighbor down here that's contemplating, South St. Paul, that's contemplating an ask in November. So there's still things going on, I think, because of the where November lies and what's going on, and kind of from the national perspective, there's been, typically that's common that there isn't as much going on in these types of years from the standpoint of off elections for school districts and other folks. So that's not uncommon to see that from that perspective. But there's a lot of activity, and I think there's going to be quite a bit of activity still coming as we go into looking at elections that'll happen in the spring of 23 for capital levies as well. And then there's a fair amount of levies, and Aaron, I know, has done this, that we'll be looking at doing at least renewals in November of 23 for authorities that are expiring or authorities that they're looking for some additional resources as districts are trying to navigate as some of the federal money is kind of running out for districts, as that has helped kind of support some of the districts across the state in the short term.
And I'll just mention too, we're working with, as Matthew mentioned, a handful of districts with expiring operating referendums or capital project levies. Some are going a year early for that renewal, but we do have some others that this is their last year of authority, and so they're going out in this November too. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag as far as who's going a year early and who's going in that final year.
Yeah, and some of the districts on the west side, I kind of refer to them as the Gold Coast sometimes. There's 2 districts that are looking to go to the cap or close to the cap right now with their authorities out that they're going to have out in November. So, yeah.
Just to make sure, for the OPEB piece, which I want to make sure because it's kind of a little newer to us, is everybody clear on the bonded versus levied versus both? Just make sure that we all got that as it came through. Okay, just want to make sure because I think that's really important to note the way that falls out, how some people did one or the other, 11 did both. Okay, just checking to make sure we didn't want to go through that one more time. Excellent. Anything else for these gentlemen? All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And obviously, if there's anything else, you can let these folks know, and Jennifer can get a hold of us, and we can get you what you need. Yeah, thank you.